That song brings out a lot of emotions for me because I am a broken person. Was. Still broken in other ways, but I'm working through them. I'm a little nervous tonight. I got a big crowd here. I want to say thanks to my family, and my kids are here tonight. They've never heard this, so this one's going to be a good one. I'm a grateful believer in Jesus Christ who has been washed clean from drugs and alcohol by the blood on the cross. I'm still working on many shortcomings that God has and is revealing to me daily. My name is Daniel. I am the baby of 3 kids. My brother is 10 years older, and my sister, who is here tonight, is 6 years older. So yes, when I came around, it was basically a free-for-all. I grew up on a farm in Mattawan, Michigan. My home growing up was surrounded by corn in my very early years. Eventually, my grandfather passed, and it went from corn to asparagus. I wasn't raised in a, quote, Christian home, but I grew up in a loving home. Typical farm kid. When I was 11, I was driving tractors, working on the farm. My uncle came home and took over after Grandpa passed, and I was his right-hand man, Lefty. My father worked at Georgia Pacific Paper Company in Kalamazoo for 34 and a half years, before they shut it down. He worked 7 days a week, 6:30 to 2:30, never missed time. Dad had a set schedule, and he very rarely went off of it. I'll go off script. He knew every traffic light from Mattawan to Georgia Pacific. My mother worked at what we knew as the pickle factory in Mattawan. They actually made and still make caulk for all kinds of construction projects, the kind we buy at hardware stores. Growing up was really unremarkable. Dinner at 3:30, fishing, farming, typical childhood for some, dream childhood for others. During the 80s, my parents bowled a lot. Men's league 2 times a week for dad and women's once a week for mom, with couples on Sunday. The reason I mention this is because of all the years I spent in bowling alleys, I can honestly count on one hand the times I ever saw my parents drink. They just didn't do it. I do remember my dad ordering a beer one time and watching him take maybe 2 or 3 sips from it, and then it sat there. About a half hour later, he was drinking a Pepsi. And to this day, I truly believe he just ordered it to fit in with his buddies. I say all this because I'm sure you all are wondering how I got so screwed up. I believe my drinking began when I was around 10 or 11 years old while staying the night at my Paw Paw's house in Plainville. He would let me sip his beer as we were downstairs deshelling walnuts. It was cute then, but as I look back now, I realize what a mistake. I truly enjoyed my time with my Papa and Grandma. I was very close to both of them. And he passed when I was 13, and it devastated me. I ended up going into what I believe was a serious depression after his passing, and I started to rebel as a teenager, to the point of almost causing my parents to divorce. You see, my mother was very protective of me and basically coddled and babied me, as did my sister. Whereas my father was a strict man who had rules and regulations, and I felt that I didn't need to follow them. I started dabbling with marijuana and alcohol at a very young age. I believe I was 14 or 15. I didn't feel at the time that it was all that bad. You see, I wanted to be so much like my brother. As I watched him and his friends drink and have poker games, I thought that was what life was like. Fun, games, laughing, sometimes fighting, but in the end, everybody smiled and everybody was happy, or so it seemed. At the age of 15, I lost one of my best friends to a car crash. And on that particular night, I was at the home of the friend that I lost. I had left for home about 15 minutes prior to the crash. I was awakened at 5:30 in the morning to go back to my friend's home, where I found all my other friends in the basement crying. This started a terrible trend of drinking every weekend to drown out pain and forget the sorrow. I was able to connive and fool my parents for many years as to my binge drinking and alcoholism. At the age of 16, I bought my first car from my father. I had pretty much a full-time job and quite a bit of freedom. I was a terrible student as far as homework and grades went, but was well liked by staff and teachers. I managed to squeak by in school. The main skills that I mastered were learning how to fool people and hide things from them. One of the many loves that I did have was music. I sang and played guitar, and this probably started even more of a downward spiral as far as my drinking went. I formed my first band while in high school. We were able to practice at a friend's home whose parents built us a studio silent room in their basement. It was on those nights as we were practicing at 1 or 2 in the morning that we were able to sneak into the father's bar and sneak us booze. During my senior year of high school, I was able to somewhat move out of my family's home and in with my best friend. Back in that time, adults thought the best thing to do was purchase our booze, but take our car keys, so we didn't drive anywhere. Many nights spent playing poker. How? I don't know, other than a lot of night school and summer school, but I did manage to graduate from Madeline High School in 1993. It set course the path of freedom and independence, or so I thought. Working on the farm, I knew my love and my career would involve tractors. I'd already spent 2 summers working for an excavating contractor, and I somewhat knew how to run a backhoe, so it wasn't a hard decision to take a full-time job, 60 plus hours a week running heavy equipment. Fast forward to 1994, I was working 50 to 70 hours a week and playing in my first bar band. Back then, if you played in the band, they automatically assumed you were at least 21. So this only increased the amount of drinking that was truly going on in my life. In April of 1994, I had an old beat-up pickup that I had taken the weight off of the back. And on that particular night, we were playing at a bar in Otsego, and I proceeded to overindulge. You couldn't really tell, but the owner did, and she encouraged me to stay after the bar closed, as she was going to make me some food and give me some coffee. But I, of course, felt I was just fine. So I snuck out and drove down 6th Street from Otsego to Texas Corners, and it had snowed just enough to make the road slick. And as I went around a curve near the Kalamazoo Speedway, the back end of the truck came out from underneath me and slid down into a ravine and hit a group of oak trees. During this, I also hit the windshield and cracked my head open pretty good. There was blood coming out, so I used my hand and my shirt to try to stop the bleeding, and I was obviously freaking out over what I was going to do. When I opened the door, I fell out of the truck, not realizing I was in a swamp. So now I look like the swamp monster. I decided to knock on the door of a home with a light on at 2:30 in the morning. And I'm sure to this day that those folks are traumatized and have PTSD. And they thought, what is going on? But they were nice enough to actually hand me a phone through the chain door so that I could call my buddies to come and get me before the cops did. Well, I told them 6th Street, but not which direction. They managed to find me, but not until after the police officers had me in the back of the patrol car. I knew the officer, and he did help me in some ways as far as taking his sweet time to get to the station to do the official BAC, blood alcohol content. This was the first run-in with the law, and I found myself with the penalties of making bad choices in my situation. They cost me the loss of my license for 60 days and numerous fines. It also got me to slow down on my drinking. But of course, as any addict would know, that didn't last very long. I continued to drink and make bad choices, and yet managed to somehow not find myself in trouble with the law, even though many times I should have been. As I look back, I realize that God had his hand in every step of this path and journey that I'm on. So began the cycle of the struggle between self-control and total surrender to Christ's control. Fast forward, 1998, I was involved in my church and I had started a successful excavating company and met who I thought was going to be the future Mrs. Brooks. My focus became more about my status as a big shooter in the excavating game instead of the actual business itself. In a nutshell, I got too big for my britches and believed I could manage my drinking. I thought I was able to have 1 or 2 drinks with no issues. Well, as has been demonstrated in my past, 1 or 2 turned into 6 or 8, which turned into 12 to 24. As I like to tell people, 1 is too many and 12's not enough. My drinking caused my fiance to seek out in others the things she was missing from me. And my drinking increased, and this led to the downfall of what could have and should have been a very successful business. I placed more emphasis on the drinking and hobnobbing than I did on the actual business itself. It lasted 3 years, the first year being the best I ever had in my entire life, gross-wise. The second year, you could start to see the downturn, and the third year was bankrupt. This caused me to go into a depression and a drunkenness that I'd never been in before. In 2000, I received my second drunk driving conviction. This conviction was much harder than the first, as I lost my license, and it was not known when I would get it back. They set a minimum of 1 year, and they also put a boot on my truck, so I couldn't drive it at all. Well, of course, that never stopped me. I knew that I had to keep working and have a job. During the bankruptcy in my business, I was able to keep my rubber-tired backhoe, which is basically a tractor with a bucket on the front and a digger on the back. And the tractor could drive 25 miles per hour. So guess what my new form of transportation was? Yep, you guessed it. Driving a backhoe everywhere I went. What seemed funny at the time is not where I would recommend anybody to be. In 2001, I met a lady and started a relationship. I was sober at the time. This woman brought 4 children into my life. Well, although not biologically mine, I call my children to this day. And all of them are here tonight. I've been able to officiate 3 of their weddings and have been a part of almost all of my 11 grandchildren's births. We had a wonderful relationship starting out, and in 2002 I asked her to marry me. We built a brand new home in Lawton. It was the first house in the Platte. Not knowing much about finances, having children, and a home, we didn't starve, but money seemed always tight. And in 2006, I decided to further my career in education by going into hazardous materials. The money was much better, but my fiance told me not to worry about taking this job because it required me to travel across the country for weeks at a time. Again, I put my pride in the pursuit of money ahead of everything that was truly important. We were able to carry on a somewhat normal life, but there were a lot of struggles and trials, and she kept telling me the job wasn't worth it. But I could only see the finances and not the repercussions. In 2012, our relationship had deteriorated to the point where I chose to go back to my old coping mechanisms. I remember picking up a 6-pack and actually saying 1 or 2 isn't going to hurt. But as I have proven, 1 is too many and 12 wasn't enough. The drinking increased and I added pills to the mix. Because of my choices, I lost my relationship, and we also lost the home that I chased the money for. All for what? I continued to work in the environmental field, was still traveling and training to be a superintendent, and was still playing music. The music and work life continued to spiral out of control with the alcohol and the pills. My ex and I were still trying to work on things, but we couldn't get past our hurts. The drinking was out of control, and the pills, well, let's just say I was on a roll that was basically a steep hill. and I was going down it and gaining speed at a nasty momentum. I remember running into my current bosses as I was belly up to the bar, and they still remind me that they knew things were going to take a bad turn. This was in approximately April of 2013. You see, my current bosses and I worked together at a company in Kalamazoo in 2003 and 2004, at which time one left to start his own company, which is where I currently work. Now, as I've stated, I've had periods and long periods of sobriety. And I remember him asking me one night in 2003 if I wanted to go out and have a beer with everybody, to which I replied to him that I was allergic to alcohol. And he couldn't believe it. I told him I'd break out in handcuffs. So him seeing me in the bar in the shape that I was in, he knew it was only a matter of time before the big fall. Well, it ended up happening. May 18th, 2013, I was playing with my band at a private party in Gobles. I proceeded to consume mass quantities of alcohol from the time we got there at 3:30 until 11:30 that night. Driving home that night, I got stopped 100 feet from my driveway in Lawton. I was on the phone with my ex when the police pulled me over. She hung up the phone and called my oldest son, who lived with me, and he proceeded to call my middle son, who lived one road over. There's a whole lot more to this, but I'm not going to share some.
Okay.
This was my third offense, which turned it into a felony. But along with the pills they found in the truck, which led to some extra charges, and the fact that I refused a breathalyzer test, which only compounded my problems. Now they had to wake the magistrate to secure the warrant to draw my blood, and this is where my awakening starts. You see, it turns out that the corrections officer was my niece. Her response was, "Uncle Dan?" I said, "Yes, Aaron." When she went to get my paperwork, my brain started thinking, what is wrong with me? She came back and explained that my bond had been set at $25,000 cash, and the only way I was getting out would be by a bail bondsman. I managed to find one in St. Joe who drove up to Van Buren County to post my bond and give me a business card to an attorney. I walked from Paw Paw to Lawton to clear my head and do some serious soul searching. Let me remind you of what I said earlier, that God had been looking out for me for 38 years, and this was no different. He knew every plan that he had for me. Jeremiah 29:11. I know the plans I have for you. Plans to prosper you and give you hope. But I didn't have it embedded in my life quite yet. But soon.
That's right.
Many would think that I would have stopped drinking at that point, but the shame, guilt, and the pain overtook me the next couple of days. As I reached out to attorneys, the cheapest one that I could find wanted $30,000 with no guarantee that I wouldn't do time. My birthday was Tuesday, May 21st, and I spent it drinking and continued drinking into Wednesday and was halfway into a bottle when I broke down and tried to put a 9mm bullet through my head. That's it. To top it all off, my pastor, who I hadn't talked to in possibly 6 months to a year, decided to call me 5 minutes after I pulled the trigger. Coincidence? I think not. He was very persistent in pushing me to come back to church on Sunday, until I finally just said, "Fine, I'll be there." I was so angry with myself, I was angry with God, I was angry at the world. But if nothing else, I knew I was a man of my word. And when I told him I would be there Sunday, I knew I would show up. Now, in what shape, I don't know, but I knew I would be there. I was so mad at the events that had happened that I threw the bottle against the wall and it smashed. And that was the last time that I had alcohol in my system ever again. Sunday came and I got up that morning. I cleaned up and headed to church. And I know many won't understand it, and many of you will. But when I walked in the building, there was a feeling of electricity, and I didn't quite know what was going on. I remember the message to this day. The title was Give Up and Give In. And somehow I managed to stumble up to the altar where I fell on my knees and I cried, and I cried, and I cried. And it was the first time in the history of my church where men had actually laid hands on somebody and prayed over them. And for 45 minutes I cried out to God and I begged Him to take me out or make me whole as these men prayed over me. Going back to the attorney situation, this particular attorney that I was never, ever going to call from a bail bonds company had agreed to meet me on a Sunday afternoon. When I left church, I felt like I was floating. It's hard to describe, but when I stood up from that altar, I was honestly 1,000 pounds lighter. And I knew I wouldn't drink. I journeyed to St. Joe to meet this attorney, all the while thinking, what am I doing using a bail bonds attorney? You gotta understand, I'm thinking, man, this is crazy. When I walked in his office, I knew it was God. He had posters and wall mounts of scriptures all over his office. And when we talked about the case and I showed him the file, he shook his head and he just asked me, what do you want? I could not go to jail as I believe I would have ended my life. And if at all possible, I didn't want felonies because it would jeopardize my career. His response was off the wall. He asked me, do you have a church? I stated I did, but I hadn't been attending very regularly. And he told me, I will take your case if you agree to get yourself back in church regularly. And I'll take the case for $3,500. But if he found out I was not attending church, the price would go to $15,000. And he would be checking. I agreed to these terms. Well, this was the start of a new journey of redemption, a journey of healing, and a journey of peace. I immersed myself in Scripture, I immersed myself in services, and I allowed God to start working in my life and showing me exactly where and who I needed to be. The very first book in the Bible that He led me to read was the book of James. I think all of you know that. I read that book and continue to this day to read that book numerous times a year. The scripture that sticks out the most to me is James chapter 1, verse 2 and 3 that says, consider it joy when you fall into struggles, for the testing of your faith produces patience. This journey I've been on for over the last 10 years has been a journey out of chaos. In September of that year, I walked out of the courtroom not only free, but felony free. I will say that all that glory goes to God. On the day of my sentencing, I was sitting in the courthouse alone, reading my Bible and praying. But my pastor walked in and said, now I know why God led me here today. You see, he didn't know my sentencing was that day, as I didn't tell anybody what was going on. I did lose my license for approximately a year, and then I was granted a restricted license. That meant I got to have one of them little breathalyzers in my truck. The price of this unit was $76 per month, plus the $250 install fee. I could then apply for a full license after a year, but having this in my truck didn't bother me. I drove over 30,000 miles that first year. The young man that did the downloads every month kept telling me I needed to go to the courts and apply for a full license, to which I stated there wasn't no need to spend thousands in an attorney fees. I didn't have a problem carrying it. Well, and I got 2 years, but it's actually 2.5 years, I decided to break down and see if I would actually be eligible. A lot of prayer went into this decision and actually for the Secretary of State hearing officer. After realizing the possible pain I could have caused many people, I knew that that job was not one I could ever do. And I told him that. I prayed and I answered his questions as honestly as I knew how. And I looked him directly in the eye as he asked me questions about sobriety and my continued plan to stay that way. I explained to him that I was not doing a program and that my recovery came through my Lord Jesus Christ. After we left, my attorney smacked me in the arm and told me that was probably not the smartest thing I had ever said. And that he would be surprised if I was granted a full license. Like I said, God had his hand in all of this. 2 weeks later, I got a call from my attorney who could not believe that I had received my full driving privileges in under 2 weeks, when it usually takes 4 to 6 just to get the determination. In 2015, I surrendered my whole heart and my life to serving, and I felt the calling to be the pastor. And through the Great Lakes Baptist Missionary Association, I was ordained in my home church, Unity Missionary Baptist Church in Paw Paw. And I've been serving God ever since and will not look back. I've tried to get involved in different recovery groups, but none of them would understand or accept that my higher power was and is Jesus Christ. When I talked about this, I was shunned and asked not to preach. In some groups, I was made to feel that I was different and didn't quite belong, even to the point of being singled out by certain folks, their demeanors and how they spoke, knowing that I was a pastor and seeing how I would respond to certain language. My friend Jewel introduced me to Celebrate Recovery at Freshwater Church. I went once, and I believe it was in 2020 that I met Ron for the very first time. I wasn't a regular attender, as I would bounce in and out once in a blue moon. And in 2021, I had a situation where a relapse was easily at my grasp. And I knew I needed to get back in a recovery group. So I started attending regularly, hardly missing any meetings. I have to tell you, it's been the best decision of my life. This is my family. This is God's story. Every struggle, every trial, every hurt, habit, and hang-up that I've gone through in my life was only to glorify Him and to show people that He is the great healer. I close with this. Come to me, all who are weary, and I will give you rest.